Welcome, everybody. We're so happy to see you on this beautiful spring Friday. Happy spring break to those of you who are on spring break. My name is Jen Weddle, and this is Sarah Kliegman, and we are the co-directors of Okanogan Highlands Alliance. And we are super excited that we're going to be hearing about bees tonight, because we also sort of are like channeling our bees, feeling of the busy season is coming. Up at Triple Creek, we've got lots of upcoming activities, including planting and educational events and weaving, and we welcome you to join us if you are interested in learning about wetland restoration. We also have a ton of environmental education events with kids over the next couple months. So if you're interested in joining any of adventures in the woods with everywhere from kindergartners to 12th graders, we would love to have you on any of our environmental education field trips. We also have a slate of trail days that will start happening probably around in May. So we're really excited for lots of action up in the Highlands, enjoying the beautiful scenery together, and we hope to see you lots more over the next several months. And now I think I'm going to turn this over to Sarah.
Hi everybody, so nice to see you all here. Many of those events that Jen talked about, especially the trail days, are headed up by our extremely capable board of directors. And I'd like to take a minute to say thank you and to acknowledge our board. We have some members here today. Anna Kliegman, our president, is here. And you might have seen some of the pictures of some of the other board members. John McReynolds, Rick Massey, Charlie Walker, Bertha Villa, Paul Gelino, and Tia Wold are a super capable group of people that we are eternally grateful to have helping us with all of the projects that we're involved in. Speaking of the busy bees, David Kliegman, our senior advisor, and I just wrapped up a really busy month doing the annual meeting to the mining company up there, evaluating all the data and giving a presentation to the agencies and to the company about the ongoing water quality problems at the mine and what we think they should and could be doing to deal with it. So lots going on. Thanks, Jen, for that rundown of all those things. I think I will wrap up with that business by introducing our speaker tonight, David Jennings. We're really thrilled to have him here today. He is an inveterate bee chaser, but he's had a lot of different roles throughout the time. Currently president of the Washington Native Bee Society. He's worked closely with Don Rolfs, who many of you maybe interacted with in the past through OHA events. He has a background in wildlife ecology, conservation, and biostatistics. He has been a Washington State Fish and Wildlife Commissioner and is also active with the Washington Butterfly Association, the Gifford Pinchot Task Force, and the Audubon Society. And we are thrilled that he made the trip over to join us and to share his knowledge and understanding with us. So please join me in welcoming David Jennings.
So I'm David Jennings. Can everybody hear me? And it's not distorted or anything. So actually, Tonasket has a special place in my heart. Don and I were right around the state chasing bees for the last several years. He passed away recently. But he did analysis looking at ecoregions and said, there's this one ecoregion in the Pasayten that I think may have a bee species, a bumblebee species that's never been detected in Washington. So we went up several different years looking for it and actually found it. So we found a brand new bumblebee for Washington State, which is pretty neat, in your backyard. We're hoping to go back and look for some of the smaller native bees, but I just want to say Tonasket has a special place in my heart because this is where we start our trips to go up to Iron Gate and upwards. So Don, Chris works in the Department of Agriculture. He is pulling together with a couple other people the master checklist of known bee species in Washington. We have currently documented 582 species that were confirmed. We think there may be as many as 725 or 750. So we're looking for those other bees. We went to the legislature last year before last, and said, we really need to know, because they were having this pollinator health task force. They were concerned about pollinators. And so we said, well, the bees are the best pollinators. You guys are going to learn why. And we don't even know the species we have. So they said, that's important. We want to do that. They've hired a bee taxonomist, and now volunteers and all this hold us up, and you can talk to me later. But Washington State has what we call a native bee atlas, or a bee atlas. We train you how to catch these little tiny bees that you don't even recognize as bees, because everybody recognizes a bumblebee, but the little tiny ones are so diverse and so tiny that it's hard to even know they're bees. And then we turn them into the taxonomist, and she trains and she identifies them to species for us, so we can build up that list. Other things we're doing with that data is we'll be looking at the pollen that they carry, because that pollen can be analyzed to understand what plant is associated that the bee is collecting to feed its young. So we will be developing lists of the important pollens sources at an eco-regional level around the state, so we can have developed restoration seed mixtures that favor pollinators. So a lot of value from this program, and it gets you out in the field. About 4 years ago, we started the Washington Native Bee Society. This is our poster, one of the posters we have. We're the first and only state-level Native Bee Society in the United States. We did plagiarize the idea from BC, so it's not totally original, but we worked with them closely. They were excited. This poster the pictures come from one of our board members, and he actually designed the poster as well. This is a fundraiser for us. Our goal with the funds we raise, the majority of the funds we raise, is to get it into the hands of teachers. So for most of the profits we get from this, we then turn them into posters to give to teachers for free. It costs us $1 to $2, depending on how many we order at a time. So we're a nonprofit. If you don't have any money, you can have the poster for free. If you can afford to donate a little bit of money, it helps us meet our goal of getting this in the hand of educators. So we have some out here and more in my truck. We already talked about Dawn. Lisa is the third part of the triad of Dawn, Lisa, and myself for looking native bees for a long time. And then obviously my wife lets me do these kind of things, so I have to certainly give her credit. She says it's really nice to get you out of the house. So, I think we both win. But we'll talk about background and biology about bees, other common pollinators, why bees are so much better. Not that I'm prejudiced as pollinators, but there's actually reasons for that. We'll take a break and come back. We'll walk through a bunch of local bumblebees that you might be able to identify on your own once you've seen these. Talk about native conservation and next steps. So that's sort of the outline for this afternoon, or for this evening. So when we talk about pollination, the first question is, well, what is pollination? And pollination is when the pollen from a flower gets to a stamen of that same species of flower. And so when you bring it over, all of a sudden, then it's been, the fruit gets set, they can start, reproducing properly. Almost all flowering plants require pollination. Some, like strawberries, can just do it without pollination, but they're not as healthy, but it's possible. So you can't say all plants need pollination. But pollination requires the transfer of pollen from one flower to another of the same species. 85% of flowering plants use animals to transfer that pollen, and about 80% of those are bees. The other 50% use wind. For example, all the yellow stuff that comes out of the conifers. That's an example of a wind-borne pollination approach. Ragweed, same kind of thing. A lot of grasses put out a lot of pollen and so let the wind carry it. But the majority of flowering plants require pollination using some sort of a vector, either wind or animals. And without pollination, plants are sort of up the creek. When pollination happens, it results in fruits that gets eaten by us and by the wildlife, berries, seeds for the next generation of flowers. Nuts are examples of fruits. So a lot of animals depend on pollination because it results in food for the animals, as well as successful reproduction for the flower. And the bottom line for flowers is it makes sure that they're going to be breeding or having the next generation of flowers being produced in plants. So when we talk about native pollinators, who are we talking about? What are they doing and why should we care about it? Well, part of the reason is without pollinators, plants don't succeed. 85% of the plants will not succeed without a vector like bees or butterflies to carry that pollen from one to another. You know, the ragweed and the pine trees can do it because they use wind, and that doesn't require an animal. But functionally, there's an ecological term called keystone species. And keystone species is a species in that ecosystem that if you remove it, the ecosystem will drastically change. The concept first came out of University of Washington, where they were looking at the outer coast on the rocks that get partially submerged and partially not submerged, you know, like underwater and back up and dry. And they were looking at the whole host of species that lived on those rocks. And they were doing experiments. They took off, in one experiment, all the large starfish, ogre stars. And what they found was as soon as they did that, the whole thing turned into mussels. Because the starfish was eating the mussels, which was opening up spaces for all the other species to come into. But as soon as there was no predator, then it turned into a monoculture of mussels. So that was where they first came up with the concept. And they found that whole concept worked in a lot of other environments. So it's the species in which, if they're not present, the ecosystem will change significantly. And that's very true for bees. I just thought this was nice from the guy that wrote Sherlock. Pollinators can be insects, and most pollinators are insects. Bees, butterflies, moths. We were just talking about about what happens at night, and our light's bad at night, and actually a fair number of flowers are specifically designed to get fertilized by moths in the evening and at night. So it happens daytime and nighttime. We just never looked for them in the past at night. So we've come to appreciate the moths are a very important part of that system, that equation. But also flies, wasps, beetles, anything that goes from one flower to another. But also some vertebrates like birds. People think about hummingbirds and bats in the saguaro desert. They go into the saguaro cactus and fertilize it. And I just learned recently that in the tropics there's some lizards that are important for certain plants to get pollinated. So it's not just insects, but 80% of the plants that use animals use bees. And we'll talk about why that is. But first I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the other pollinators we have here in Washington. Skipper, that long antenna, or that long proboscis. These are just pretty pictures so you can enjoy the moment and digest your dinner. So you see that butterfly, but do you notice the beetle? So that's an example of a beetle that's also possibly helping pollinate. And when you start looking, you find other beetles, large and small, on the flowers. And a pollination only requires for you to somehow capture pollen on your body, go to a flower of the same species, either on the same plant or a different plant, but the same species, and have that pollen get picked up by that next flower for pollination to happen. Daytime flying moths, nighttime flying moths. These are clearwing moths. You do have them around here. Have them on the west side too, but they're called that because you can actually see through the wing. Can you see the wing through it? And bees, and this is a bumblebee. Where's the pointer? So bumblebees often carry pollen on their legs. They have a long antennae with a sort of a notch in it or a bend. flies. Wait, is this a bumblebee or a fly? And how do you tell them apart? This is the fly, and it's two easy ways to figure out it's not a bee, because I used to get fooled by this. Darn it, sorry. Whoa. You see those antennae? Those are not long, and they're not long, they're tiny little things. And the size of that eye is enormous. This is a bumblebee mimic. I mean, its colors are the same as a bumblebee. It's nice and furry, but if you look a little closer, you realize it's not a bumblebee because it doesn't have those long antennae, and they've got really big eyes. All sorts of other flies do that, help go to flowers and essentially help pollinate. But again, if you look closely, you see the short little antenna and really big eyes. They also mimic flies, wasps. The whole point of mimicking is so that you won't get eaten because the predators think you're something else that might be painful or toxic or something like ladybugs. This is one that's this is a fly imitating a wasp. But again, you can see big eyes, really short antenna. And when you see a wasp, you're pretty sure it really is a wasp. There's some bees look like wasps, and we won't get into that unless people have questions about it, but when you see a wasp, for the most part, you're like, oh yeah, I do not want to pick that up with my bare hands. It's a really good clue that it might not be, that it might be a wasp. So what's our focus for native bees as compared to all these other pollinators that are out there? What we're finding is that bees are really important for keeping the diverse nature of our plants and ecosystems. They are the most important group of bees, of insects, of actually any group for pollinating flowers. Of 80% of the flowers pollinated by animals are pollinated by bees. When you look at the evolutionary history, you realize that shortly after flowering plants occurred on the landscape, like I don't know the number, 200 million years ago, bees showed up, and very quickly they both spread out and got very diverse because they started figuring out, oh, the bee said, oh, if I come here, I can get food, and the flower's like, I want you to come here because then you'll help me pollinate. And everybody else, for the most part, is showing up late to the party, I'm going to steal some nectar. I don't mean to be prejudiced, but that's kind of how it works out. And I'll sort of demonstrate that. The other is, most native bees, if you look at this poster, and so these are all to scale, relatively speaking. So the bumblebees aren't quite that big, but when you figure out how big a normal bumblebee is, and look at some of these guys, they're like 3-4 millimeters. So until you start focusing and looking for those native bees, most people don't even notice them. I didn't. I could see the bumblebee and I was, oh, bumblebee. But then I'm like, oh, wait, what's that? What else am I seeing? Oh, those are all native bees. Sorry, this just makes me sad. And you see native bees on the landscape disappearing very quickly for a variety of reasons. Of the 582 species that we know have occurred in Washington, we haven't seen 25% in the past 25 years. Now, that's not saying necessarily that they're extinct in Washington, but it says they're not as common as they were. And one of the reasons we're doing the atlas is to see if we can refine them or if we really have lost them off the landscape. Unlike almost all other insects, bees, both adults and young, eat nectar and pollen only. If you think about a wasp, the wasp is on that flower because it's getting, the adult wasp, because it's getting nectar as fuel. It's sugar water, keeps it going to fly around. But they feed their young larvae, like the tarantula wasp. Like gets that tarantula, kills it, and brings it back to lay its egg on. So it's using animals for feeding its young. And that's true of a lot of other insects. So bees are the only ones that intentionally collect pollen and move it to another flower. Deliberately collect pollen and move it. So what that means is all the other pollinators are not very efficient at what they're doing. relative to bees. And again, if you look at the evolutionary history, you see that bees and flowering plants have really evolved hand in hand. And that's why we have so many of them. So we looked at this clearwing moth earlier, but this is a side view. So let me just point out what it's doing. So it's got its front legs, keeping the flower at a fair distance because it doesn't really want to get any pollen on it. That's just something it's got to deal with to get off of. And it's sticking this long proboscis into the flower to get the nectar. From a flower's perspective, that's a thief, right? It's not helping me get pollinated. It's not helping me transfer pollen somewhere. And it's stealing the nectar that might be attracting bees. But in the big scheme of things, nature has been really abundant, so we can all have that happen and we get that diversity. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just if you like bees, you can brag about how good bees are, like I'm doing right now. So if you look at this guy, and again, you can see right through the wing, you can see that he's not really getting close, but if you look down here, that's a native bee. And what it's doing is rolling around in the pollen, gathering as much pollen on its body as it can and packing it tight, because that's what it's taking back to feed its young. And so that's one of the main reasons that bees are such much better pollinators. They actually deliberately collect pollen and then fly to another flower and do the same thing. Does that make sense, everybody? So that's why plants like bees. Bees are not really stealing their resources. They're being attracted to the flower by the resources to help the, and I'm being anthropomorphic, to help the flower get pollinated. Oh, sorry, forgot to show you the round circle. And this is a fly. And you can see it doesn't want to touch the flower, pick up any pollen. It's got a really long proboscis or snout to stick into the flower to get the nectar. Again, from an efficiency of a pollinator perspective, it's not a very good pollinator from the plant's perspective. In addition to actually collecting pollen, deliberately collecting pollen and putting it on their body, they have another behavior called constancy. And this is the key that makes those two things together, but this is an important part of it, make bees such important pollinators for almost all the plants. So constancy translates as faithful and dependable. As far as a bee goes, and this is an individual bee, so most native bees are solitary. The female comes out, is already been fertilized the last fall, or she gets fertilized by the males that come out early in the spring, whenever the males and the females come out. But she does it all by herself. She gathers the pollen and the nectar, she makes the nest cavity, the brood cell, either underground or in a stem or something, one at a time. What the bee wants to do is be as efficient as possible when she's gathering the resources she needs to feed her young. She doesn't have a lot of time to waste. So she'll come across a flower, say, let me learn how to open the secrets of this flower, because flowers don't really want to give their pollen and nectar out to anybody. They've got all these other folks showing up saying, I want some of that. And the flower's like, you're not going to take it to the right place. I don't really want you. But the bee says, because I'm collecting pollen, I need to learn how to extract that pollen as efficiently as possible for that flower type. So once she learns that flower, she will continue to do that same species of flower over and over and over again. I'm speaking in generalities, that's probably like 80% of the time. One plant at a time, one species of plant at a time. So from the plant's perspective, you've got somebody who's collecting pollen deliberately and then bringing to a different flower of the same plant, greatly increasing the probability of pollination to happen. And in fact, when you look at the evolution of plants and bees, you realize a lot of the flowers have their stamens hanging over, so when the bee goes in, the stamen's going to be able to pick up the pollen that's been collected, the extra pollen, maybe not on the legs, but on the back and everywhere else. And they only need one or two pieces of pollen, so for them, it's a really good approach to getting pollinated. So I'm going to repeat myself because I know don't always keep the words up with what I'm saying. So she learns how to be efficient at that flower and goes and does it. Now, she'll go and when she can't find any more of that flower, it's not like she'll stop and not do anything. She'll switch to a new flower, but once she figures out how to efficiently extract pollen from that new flower, she'll go to that second flower over and over and over again. Again, from the plant's perspective, that is an amazing partner for pollination to happen. And it's different for each bee. So in a bumblebee colony, you might have upwards of 200 to 300 workers going out and collecting. But they're not all 200 going to the same species of plant. Each one comes out of the nest and says, what flower do I encounter that seems abundant? Let me learn how to use it. But what that means is that a variety of plants get pollinated by bumblebees. But it's different individual bumblebees going to that same flower over and over. Does that make sense? Tracking with me? But because it's for the individual bee, not for the species of bee, unless some species are like, oh, we only go to this genus, we only go to this one flower. But in general, they'll take advantage of what they can find on the landscape because they only have so much time. What that results in is a variety of species of plants that get pollinated by the bees. Not just, I like this one, I'm only going to this one, because there's a lot of different individual bees saying, well, I know how to unlock this flower. Fred or Mary know how to unlock this one. Elizabeth knows how to do this one. And so at the landscape level, bees really help a wide variety of plants get pollinated. And you can see that behavior in action. So when you look at this woman, strong woman, you see that? That's the pollen that has been collected on her leg. And one thing that jumps out at you is it's all the same color, right? And that's because she's been going to the same flower type over and over and over again. And so the pollen's all the same color because she's only been harvesting from that one species, that one plant species. Does that make sense? So you can see the behavior and the result. These are just a few pictures of bumblebees, but you can see that for all of these, one color of pollen she's got. It's also amazing how much pollen an individual bee can carry. Like she can carry almost 1/3 of her weight in pollen on her side. I mean, that's amazing. Unfortunately, that's a big hunk of pollen for this bee. She's got a similar one on the other side to keep her balance. So, they're very efficient because they need to feed their young, but they're also going to the same species of flower. This individual is going to the same species of flower over and over again to get that much pollen. So from a plant efficiency, a plant pollination perspective, bees are the bee's knees, right? I just made that up. It's painful. I'm sorry.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
How does that get on her leg and not everywhere else on her body? Does she put it by her mouth?
Right, so different bees have different strategies,
Yeah.
but bumblebees will collect a little bit of nectar and mix it with the pollen to make it a little sticky, and then they'll pull all the pollen off most of their body and then pack it on their leg. So it doesn't show, they have deliberately put it on a structure that holds the pollen. Good question. Because you don't see a lot of, you don't see a lot of pollen anywhere else on her because she's trying to, her objective is to get as much pollen back to her young as she can, so she'll groom all the stuff off and pack it down. Not all bees carry it on their legs. This is a leafcutter bee. They carry it on the bottom of their abdomen. So that's all pollen. And again, what's the behavior it's illustrating? Constancy, right? It's all yellow. So it's not just bumblebees, it's basically all species of bees will only collect from a single flower type if it's available. They don't necessarily carry it just on their legs. This one carries it, this orange is a pollen. They also carry it on their bodies a little bit. And we saw the last one that carried it underneath the abdomen. So they're all different, but they all have the same objective, collect pollen and bring it back to feed their young. And when they run out of the flower that they've been working on, they will switch to a new flower. Because most bees, I'm going to pause. I'm talking about bees in general. The reality is we have lots of different species, and so this generic bees do this is true for about like 80% of them. We have a bunch of kleptoparasites that come in and like lay their eggs in other bees' nests, so they don't really collect pollen. But for the average typical bee of a variety of species, when I say, I'm not making absolute statements, even though my words sound absolute. There's a little bit of variation in nature. But here you can see that she was collecting this kind of pollen and then couldn't find any more of that flower. So she switched to a different flower type. But she didn't get 17 different flower types. She found one. So you can see that consistency is hanging or being true even when you see two colors, because they're going to be one and then the other. They're not mixed. Tracking with me? So in the United States, we're estimating 4,000 native bee species, which is a lot. In Washington, that says 650. That was the guess. We now have a better estimate. I forgot to update my slide. I apologize. But we now have confirmed, like with specimens under the microscope, 582 species. We have about 36 that the data is not that clear with. But the estimate is we have somewhere between 725 and 750 species. So going back to this atlas I was talking about, we're running around the state, and you can be part of that we, collecting bees to figure out what species we have and where and when. The average adult bee, solitary native bee as opposed to bumblebees, the average solitary native bee female is on the landscape somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks. And then she's done for the year. Over the course of the summer, you'll have multiple species of bees come out early spring, mid-spring, early summer, late summer, early fall. So there might be several different species of bees that are very similar to each other across the summer, but each species will have an adult presence on the landscape of about 2 to 4 weeks. And it's often shorter than that. And that's why, in part, we have so many different species of bees. And that's why bees are so important for so many different species of plants. Because plants are have their flowers in the spring and in the summer and the fall. And so there's bees that have evolved to take advantage of all of those opportunities. So here's what some of the native bees look like. These are all from Don Rawls. He did amazing photography called stacked photos for identification purposes. But when you look at them up close, they are pretty amazing. So this is an example of one that is carrying pollen on its thorax as well as its legs. Those are all pollen holding hairs. And amazing colors and patterns when you start looking at them closely. It's just kind of fun. I'm going to have to buy myself a microscope soon so I can start doing this level of identification. And then some wild shots. But you can see how they're getting into the flower and trying to collect as much pollen as they can, going back to why they're such efficient pollinators for plants. Everybody sees it?
How many young do they usually have?
So an average, again, we're talking the big picture. The average solitary female will produce maybe 6 to 10 young.
And her whole life cycle is 2 to 4 weeks.
As an adult.
Yeah.
And yes, so she'll make all those, like maybe one a day or so. A lot of trips. They're pretty busy. Some of them actually take a day off every couple days to rest. It's pretty exhausting. Put my feet up, relax. But yeah, so it's usually 6 to 8, 6 to 10.
So at the end of that, they go back into their nest or whatever, wherever they winter, and are there until the following year?
No, they're dead.
They're dead.
They've They've been an amazing mom
Yeah.
and then die. You have taken the life energy out of me. I'm dead now. Yeah, so go ahead.
Well, are the young smaller than the adults, or are they?
So I don't have good pictures of that, and I should probably add that. So what the bee does is collects a bunch of pollen, and they have a place that they're going to put it called a brood cell. They put that brood, they make the brood cell, they put the pollen and maybe some nectar in it. They lay a single egg on that. The whole life cycle, the whole early life cycle of the bee is, you know, a little grub that looks like one, then a bigger grub, and then a bigger grub, and then it actually goes into, what's the term? When they, like when a butterfly goes into a cocoon? Metamorphosis. So then they'll, thank you, whoever. You know, when you're up here, you get nervous, I forget all the words. Then they'll metamorphosize into the adult form. So when they come out of the nest that next year, they're the same size as the adult. They are an adult, actually. You never see a young bee unless you tear a nest open.
So they stay in the nest all the way until the following season and emerge as adults?
Yes,
Wow.
great.
What's in the pollen?
A lot of protein,
Protein?
and then the nectar has some sugars in it. I'm going to go off at a quick aside here because we're talking about pollen and feeding young. So we've known for a while that some pesticides are really bad for insects, like neonicotinoids. What we're finding out is that we didn't appreciate the role of fungicides, because it turns out that the average bee larvae can't eat pollen. Pollen is very hard to digest. But in nature, what happens is you don't bring just that pollen in, you bring in fungi on the pollen. And that fungi starts breaking down the pollen to eat, and they're actually sucking up either the produce of fungi or just eating the fungi. And so with fungicides, we're finding, because all the tests have been done on adult bees, that they spray with fungicide and LD50, the lethal dose to kill 50% of individuals, to zero effect. So no, fungicides are fine. And then recently they're like, well, how come we're not getting good reproductive success? And they started looking inside the cell and found that if fungicides kept fungus from being in there, the larvae were starving. So it's like, oh my goodness, one more challenge.
Is that what a neonicotinoid is, a fungicide?
No, a neonicotinoid is a type of pesticide that came out in the 90s. And when it first came out, everybody was thrilled, because before that we used organophosphates, which are very toxic to people. So in the old days, when I was younger, you'd see the people in the agricultural fields with big zoot suits on, spraying, because what they were spraying was dangerous to the people spraying it. And with neonicotinoids, it doesn't hurt, it doesn't affect us at all. And so when neonicotinoids came out and they did the LD50s, how much does it take? They didn't see a lot of fatalities coming out of it. So everybody licensed it. I was just testifying in the legislature last month on a couple of bills for neonicotinoids. And they were saying 80% of the pesticides in the garden stores are full of neonicotinoids. And so they're trying to get those off the market. With so many bees, there's lots of ways to classify them. You can, taxonomically with all the different families and genera and subgenera and tribes. But functionally, you can say, where do they live? And so three ways to look, a way to look at that is ground nesting, and the majority of bees live in the ground. Tunnel nesting, which is often a flower, a plant with a stem that they can go into. Raspberries are a good example, blackberry stems. So the trick is, I've learned that if you're going to trim your raspberries or blackberries or stuff like that, wait until near the end of the winter to do it, because then it won't get soggy over the court. Well, not so much over here, but on the west side. Not get soggy until it's too early, because if you do it this time of year or a little bit earlier, it'll still be a fairly structurally sound tunnel for the bees to use. And then eusocial or social bees like bumblebees. So there's a few, very small number of bees that are sort of native solitary bees. They're not solitary bees. Native bees that have castes, queen, workers, and drones. And that sort of defines what a social insect is. So this is, I was walking at Maima Mountains, which is a natural area, and this caught my eye, and I looked at it, and then I realized, oh, that's a bee. And I looked at it, look, and it's full of pollen. And then it went into the hole, and all that yellow is pollen that got scraped off when it went in. But that's an example of what a common ground nesting native bee nest looks like. Just a single hole in the ground. Sometimes even though they're solitary, they might get in big aggregations, like you might have 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 bees all together. The alkali bee, which we use here in Washington for fertilizing alfalfa and other things, is that example where they're solitary, but they need the right soil type. So if the right soil type's there, then a lot of individuals will be there, even though they're still solitary, not helping each other. So this is a nice, interesting concept. EPA said, how do we divide up our ecosystems? And they came up with this concept called ecoregions. So in Washington, this is level 3. Sorry, wait, so this is level 3 ecoregions. They have a level 4, which is what I used to use. Well, Don and I used to track down the new bee species. But you can see that these are all, so that, west side, wet forest, east side, drier forest. The highlands up here is channel scablands, the Blue Mountains, the coast, the Olympics. So that's a concept of an ecoregion that's at a high level. So, everything in the red is much more related habitat-wise, soil-wise, plant-wise to itself in the red than it would be any of the other colors. So I've already talked about this. We're developing the checklist of bees. Have about 582. We haven't documented 25% of them in the last 30 years. These are the collections we've done. We excluded this analysis. We excluded honeybees and bumblebees because everybody's been taking pictures of bumblebees, and we have lots of. We know where the honeybees are. But you can see all the others. This is a particular family. This is the Apidae family. You can see we haven't actually sampled that many places in the state for it yet. Adrena, somewhat better coverage, but still a lot of places and a small number of samples when you think about the fact that Washington's, 70,000 square miles or something amazingly large. So from the native bee perspective, we actually don't know where they are when they come out on the ground very often, and there's just a lot of gaps. So again, this program where we're running around the state looking for bees in all different seasons is really going to help us fill this map in. And if you're a lister, like a birder, look at that and think, we're going to get a county record. We're going to get a state record. Just saying, That motivates me. So a lot of places we haven't even sampled for them yet. And this one, can you spot the dot? There's only, right down in the red. But we've been looking for this one because it used a particular plant, and with the plant atlas we can know where those plants are, but it's been actually hard to find the plants and the bees. But we're hoping to get more. So I'm just going to walk you through some common bumblebees. There's way more here than I expect you to learn tonight, but it'll give you an exposure of the diversity of bumblebees around here. These are all that I looked at the Xerces Bumblebee Watch site, and these have all been found in the general area of Tonasket. And then if you need to look at it later or figure it out, and then go to the Washington Bumblebee site, and it'll give you a lot more detail. You compare and contrast and talk about similar species. First, as you talked about in the first half, you have to confirm it is a bumblebee. So just to remind people, bumblebees have this sort of disjunct antenna. It's fairly long, but it's got a little notch here, or not a notch, but a bend. It's got multiple colors. Often has black across between the wings. It carries its pollen. If it's a female, males don't carry pollen. Males are just like worthless, like the rest of the males we know. They add value and some fun, but in the big scheme of things, incidental. Carry pollen, and then, so that's what makes it a bumblebee. And the eyes are not enormous, going back to the flies. Right?
Is that a proboscis, or what is that thing?
Yes, that's its tongue. It's sticking its tongue out so it can go into the flower.
Okay.
And there are long-tongued bees and short-tongued bees. But a short-tongued bee, which is a taxonomic group, can have a really long tongue. So it's one of those, evolutionary, it's a short tongue, but this individual species has a long one. So, what is it?
Fly.
Who thinks it's a bumblebee? Don't embarrass yourself. So, really short antenna, no pollen on the legs, skinny little legs that don't look like they're designed for carrying pollen, and big old eyes.
Lie.
Okay. Short antenna, big eye. Again, a bee mimic. I've been fooled when I started this a lot. Oh, there's one. Oh, but it's still fun to see. It's not a bad thing. It's just not a bumblebee. So for field ID, unless you're really into it and you carry a hand scope and you look at the side of the cheek for special features and things, you can look at it from a color pattern perspective. Okay. So, like most insects, there's a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. Now in bees, it's not called an abdomen. I keep calling it an abdomen because I started with other things. It's actually called a metasoma because it's the first segment's not a part of the abdomen. But what you're looking at is, what's the face color? Yellow, in this case, yeah, but a lot of times it'll be black. When you look at the thorax, it's divided into three parts: in front of the wings, in front of the wings, between the wings, and behind the wings. And so there can be color patterns here that help. And the main one you're looking at is the abdomen, or mesosoma. So it's got 6 segments. You actually don't see the 6th one very often. It's the little tiny thing that's tucked under. So we talk about the first 5. So the first one, second, third, fourth, and fifth. And the color pattern there helps you distinguish between different species. So this is one that occurs. This is a Hunt's bumblebee, or a Bombus huntii. Sorry. You can see it's all yellow. There's no black there. T1 is yellow, but T2 and T3 are red, and then T4 is yellow. So T is just a segment, a turtle segment. We shorten it to be a T. So T2 and 3 are red, 2 and 3 are red, and 4 is yellow. Can you see yellow, red, red, yellow? And these are one of the most attractive bumblebees, I think, with that red and yellow pattern, and they're pretty good size. A similar species, because it's red and yellow, is the central bumblebee. But it has a black area between the wings, as opposed to all yellow like the last one. And it has T1 and T2 yellow, and the red is on T3 and T4. So T1 and 2 are yellow, T3 and 4 are red. And depending on the phenotype, T5 and 6 could be either black or a little bit of yellow. But it's those first 4 that would help you distinguish between this and the Hunt's bumblebee. And again, you can see the black between the wings. Yellow, yellow, red, red. In this case, it's got red on the 5th one also. Make sense? Close up. Yellow, yellow, red, red, red. So yellow, yellow, red, red. And then in this case, the phenotype shows a red. Sometimes it'll be black. This is a smaller bumblebee. Well, some different bumblebees are different sizes, the workers, and mainly what you're going to see are, let me pause. This time of year, what you're going to see are queens. And queens are doing two things that you'll notice if you watch them for a few minutes. One is they're looking for a place to start their new colony. So the behavior that they're exhibiting when they do that is flying very close to the ground and slowly looking for a rodent burrow or some sort of a cavity they can take advantage of. And once it finds that cavity, then it'll start collecting pollen and nectar to start building up the resources to grow its first group of workers. A common bumblebee around here, and I forgot to stick in a different picture, is the two-form. It's now been pulled away from the two-form group, and it's called the Vancouver bumblebee because it has a different color morph in the San Juan Islands, which is really beautiful, which I don't have a picture of. But even though they look very different, they have, let me back up. With bumblebees, there's a phrase we use, black is red, red is black, which means different locations, the bee will show either black or red in that spot. So this one is showing a lot of black, but the one in on the San Juan Islands, all that black can be red. So it's just really breathtaking. I was like, oh, what kind of bee is that? I've never seen that before. Oh, it's the same one I've seen before, just different. How you can tell this one, and this is again a fairly small bumblebee relative to others, is it has T1 and T4 are yellow. T2 and T3 are black, so it's bounded by yellow. When you look at the thorax, I'm going to point this out before you can see this little black that comes down here on the back behind the wings, and it sort of breaks this yellow into two spots. So there's the black, and there's the two spots of yellow. So when you see this, it's very distinctive, and you can kind of see that black triangle, and that black triangle is very characteristic. From the side, now what behavior is this bee showing us? Say it louder. Yep, so it's only got one color of pollen because it's only been going to that same species of flower over and over again. And you can see those antennae with the hook in them. From the back, you can see that sort of black that's coming down to divide the rear of the thorax into two spots. This is one of my favorite ones. It's big, and it's called the white-shouldered because that's white, and that's more of a golden yellow. It's really confusing when you read the guides because all the colors are yellow unless there's white and yellow. So it might look white, but if they're not in a different part of the bee that's yellow, it's translated as a yellow. Don't ask me why, that's just how they do it. But this one you can see that white is very different from the rest of the yellow. So this is a white-shouldered bumblebee. This is a very large one, like thumb size maybe. As a worker, it's big. Again, from a different perspective, you can see the yellow contrasting with the white up front. But if there's only one or the other, that color would be called yellow. This is more of a golden yellow, but this used to be our most common bumblebee in Washington. It occurred in every single county, and within most counties, it was the most common bumblebee. And then they took some back to Europe to raise them to sell to greenhouses because bumblebees, unlike honeybees, do something, and some other bees too, do something called buzz pollination, where they grab the flower and they shake their muscles at just the right frequency or harmonics, and it causes that flower to release the pollen. I talked about earlier that a lot of plants don't want to give up pollen to someone who's not going to help them move forward in their reproductive process. So a fair number of plants have come up with a buzz pollination method that requires only the right kind of bumblebee or other bee, but not a fly or a butterfly or a beetle to be able to get that pollen, because pollen's expensive to make, so they only want to give to people that know the special code. So greenhouses are often, in this part of the country, used to grow tomatoes. And tomatoes are buzz pollinated. And so when they were trying to use honeybees, they weren't getting very good success. And without good success, your tomato plants produce small fruits and not very many of them. So people shipped a few of these queens over to Europe, raised them in large commercial quantities, brought them back to the US. What they didn't think about was all the European diseases and viruses. And so this is now the top species of concern in Washington, and is being considered for federal listing as an endangered species because we didn't do the proper sanitation and prior proper planning before we did that.
Can I ask what the range is of these bees? How far will they go?
Like an individual bee?
Yeah.
So it all depends on the size of the bee. So the little tiny ones probably don't go much more than 100, 150 yards from where they're nesting, because from their perspective, that's a long ways, right? Honeybees could go up to 5 miles, because there are a lot of them. Most bumblebees could travel a mile or more, and depending on how many resources, probably up to 3 miles. But it gets to the diminishing return. If you're the only one or only a few doing it, if you're spending all your time traveling, you're not being very efficient at what you're doing. So they don't want to travel, but they can if they have to. But 5 miles for honeybee, 3 miles plus or minus for bumblebees, and then much less for the smaller bee size you get, body size you get. So again, with what you're looking at here, you see 2 different colors you see yellow and white, right? You see that? So the bumblebee, wrong one, has I'm still learning on this one, sorry. Black face, yellow behind the head, and white on the tail. And so when you see this, it's very clear that that's what it is. Nothing else looks like that with that yellow and black, yellow and white. And if you see it, it's really nice if you report it. So you can report it a couple different ways. But the easiest way is to go to the Xerces Society, which is an invertebrate conservation organization. And they have a program called Bumblebee Watch. Not Bumblebee Atlas, which is a pain in the butt to use, but Bumblebee Watch. And all you have to do is take a couple of pictures, upload it. They'll be easily able to identify this as an individual, as the right species, and it logs it in the database as this species was seen here on this day. So if you notice one of these on your property, it's really good to document it, because we're trying to figure out what we do from a conservation perspective. And the wider it's spread, or the more numbers we get, really helps us develop the right policy for how do we do restoration work. But you can see, again, yellow, white, and white on the tail, and constancy. From the back, same thing, yellow, white, black face. The brown belted is another good sized bee. It gets its name from, from the first 1 or 2 segments are going to be brown and not black. So the brown belted. It does have a large body. It has a black spot between the wings, but not a whole bar. But when you see that brown belt, it's pretty easy to spot. And the queens have, I think, a little bit more brown, but same basic pattern. And for the most part, queens and workers look almost identical. There's not a whole lot of variation between them. Males can be a little different. Sometimes some males look very different than the females, but females and queens look very similar other than size. The queen's a lot larger because she's got to overwinter and then lays eggs for the rest of her life. Brown belted, you can see a little bit of brown up here. Black-tailed bumblebee is one of my favorites. I think it should have been called red belted because the black's not that obvious to me, but when you see the bee, you're going to see all that red across it. I'll show you the cloudy part in a minute of the thorax, but T1 is yellow, T2 and T3 are red, and T4 is called cloudy, as well as up here, because it has both black and white or yellow on it. So anytime you have a mixture of black and yellow, even if it looks white, you're going to say the term is cloudy. So if you look at it from the side, you can see this is a cloudy because you can see black hairs in with the yellow hairs, as opposed to here where there's no black hairs, and here where there's no black hairs. So this is cloudy, and you can see this is black and yellow, so that's also called cloudy. So it took me a while to figure that out, because it's like, wait, that's just black and white, black and yellow, but the term is cloudy. So
they only need to mate once and then they can lay a succession of eggs?
yes. Yeah, they'll get a whole packet of sperm that they can just dole out a little bit of time.
Smart lady.
Seems kind of boring. Where's the fun in the chase, you know?
How long do the males live?
Some people think too long, but that's my wife's opinion. They can live for a while because depending on when they come out, they may come out quite ahead of the summer queens that will be overwintering to form the new colony. So they need to be out there and hanging around to make sure they can find someone to mate with. Brush your teeth on a regular basis, take a shower. No, we're just going to change gears. And any questions about bumblebees? And again, Washington bumblebees, you can Google that. You can find a website just devoted to Washington bumblebees.
How large of an area, if you were planting flowers of the same species, would you want to do so that they can get all of the same species in one go? So, I mean, like, what kind of square, area would one bee use in one pass if they could, like, just stick with the same species of flower?
So the rule of thumb, and it's not exactly the answer to your question, but the rule of thumb is the larger the patch, the better, because that'll attract them in because they'll see all those resources. But if there's that same flower or clumps of that same flower other places in a general area, they'll be able to go between the clumps because that's how nature is. But if you just plant 2 or 3 plants, that probably won't be enough to attract the bee to start working on that flower. Does that kind of make sense?
So how many would you recommend?
About this big. I mean, I'm trying to, like, it depends on your flower, but a couple of feet across so that it's going to be a big visual attractant to them because they are sort of visually oriented. So we mentioned a lot of pollinators from steep decline. There are a few, like the one that people like with the yellow face, that seem to be expanding their range. But the thought about the yellow-faced bumblebee on the poster is that they're actually occupying the niche that had been occupied by the western bumblebee. Like, oh, I can exploit the same type of resources this other one was, and they're not there anymore, so it's easy for me to have it. And they also produce many more young per nest, per colony, than most of the other bumblebees. They can have up to 1,000 young over the course of a summer, whereas most bumblebee colonies, because you get born as a bumblebee worker, you don't live that whole summer. You live for 6 weeks or so, but over the course of the summer, you'll have a lot of different bees coming out. And so the average colony for bumblebees might be 200 to 500. In the yellow-faced bumblebee, like on the poster, they can have over 1,000. And we just had another, going back to the western bumblebee, we just had another bumblebee from the East Coast, it's being used for buzz pollination in Canada. They brought it over to Canada. It's now come into the US. We're trying to monitor it and see how bad it's going to be to us. But it has colonies of like 1,500 or 2,000. So again, we're not seeing a lot of competition. It's going to be a little later in the season, but they have the potential to really take a lot of resources that our natives would have been using.
So when the queen lays that 1,500 to 1,000, 1,500 eggs, they don't all hatch at once. They hatch on a, like, 6 weeks, every 6 days, 50 of them hatch?
Yeah, right. She starts out with like 6 or 7, because that's all she can keep going, because she has this limiter. But once she has other workers to collect more pollen, then she'll pretty much be constantly making eggs. But functionally, there's a lot of determiners of how quickly it takes that egg to hatch, like how warm it is. So if you're in the middle, or if you're being brooded, because they can make a little bit of internal heat. And I'll just say, one of the reasons that bumblebees are so good in places like here and up in the Arctic is they can raise their internal temperature by like just moving their muscles without flying. And so they fly, I've seen them in 40-degree weather up here in rain. In the Arctic, they fly at 32 degrees. So when they're brooding, they can raise the heat, but the heat's going to be primarily focused on the ones in the center. So some of those will be bigger than the ones on the outside.
So 2 things are going on. She's laying the eggs over time,
Yes.
not all at once.
Right.
And then each egg, as it reaches a certain temperature, just hatches at that. Cool.
Or it gets the right size and runs out of food, or, yeah.
Cool.
Anyway, we're trying to figure out pollination trends. With native bees, unlike bumblebees are one, they're a big group, a lot of people can identify them. The other bees, we have so little data, we don't know the fact that we haven't seen them in 30 years. Should that be concerning? I think so, but we don't have enough data to actually draw any scientific conclusions, which is what we need to push public policy. So that's another reason why we're doing the atlas, to actually understand when and where we have native bees on the landscape. A lot of different reasons. We were talking at the break about global warming upsetting when flowers flower versus when bees are available.
What, on the previous slide, it mentioned something about the trend to some kind of landscaping, yeah.
Oh, well, I'm just saying, when you look at the landscape, the big picture, we have all these things happening. We're losing habitat through turning it into concrete in cities. We're turning it into agricultural areas. We're spraying everything with pesticides. We're fungicides are being used. So that's what I mean by the landscape level. All the things we see are not good for bees, and they all seem to be expanding. So the big picture is kind of sad to care.
All of these dry xeriscape landscaping with all those rocks, they're pretty toxic, aren't they, for bees?
I think that's a nuanced question. So if you're in an arid habitat, there probably are plants that might be able to handle that dry landscaping approach. Up here, it probably would work not nearly as well. But watching, at least, we haven't really gotten into how much water do we need to conserve and take. I mean, I think people shouldn't have lawns anyway. That's just my personal opinion, as opposed to native habitat. But I think dry scaping is a mixed bag. Does that make sense?
How quickly is recovery after wildfire? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, it turns out it depends on the species. It's all species specific. But in general, wildfires aren't bad for bees. They're opening up the landscape. They're letting a lot of sun hit the forest floor. You're getting a big bloom of annuals and short-term perennials, all of which most bee species like. So,
And how important is water?
pretty important. I mean, they do need water to drink, although they can often get the liquid needs met through nectar. But if it's so dry that the plants are producing nectar in quantity, then, sort of what comes first, the chicken or the egg type thing. I know I've been talking a lot, so I'm trying to get through these because everybody's probably ready to go home. So habitat loss, habitat fragmentation. Again, the smaller the patch of landscape, the easier it is for a random event to really hurt that population. It's called a stochastic event, but if you have 2,000 grizzly bears, chances are you're gonna have male and female cubs produced every year. When you get down to a population of 20, random chance can say all those 20 are males, all the cubs. So that's an example where, because you got such a small population size, they're at much greater risk for local extinction, which is called extirpation. So we don't have many pileated woodpeckers in Seattle, so it's extirpated in Seattle, but it's still present on the larger landscape. Whole concept of island biogeography we're not going to talk about. Invasive species I just talked about, the eastern common bumblebee that's showing up, and other things. Pesticides, neonicotinoids, fungicides. It turns out that one of the reasons that we should not be planting ornamentals, we like ornamentals in part because they do real well, and they do real well because insects can't eat them. Most plants and insects have evolved together, and plants develop this thing called secondary compounds, which is what they produce to make themselves taste bad to the bees, or to the whatever insect's going to be eating them, caterpillars. When you bring them over to the foreign country, and within their native habitat, there's a race going on between the plants and the things that eat them to keep up with the secondary compounds that get built up. You take that plant to a new continent, the insects there can't eat it. So that's why they grow so well, because nothing's eating them. And so we're starving a lot of our other insects because we have so much non-native plants on our landscape. There's a much smaller food source, even though we look at it, we see all these green plants, the numbers of insects are just like dropping quickly. Going back to this, yes?
What do you mean by ornamentals?
There's ornamentals are two groups. One is a native plant that's been selected for certain characteristics like color or double blooms or something. So that's one type of ornamental, and that's not great. The other is that a lot of our ornamentals are actually plants that have been brought over from Europe or Asia. And so those are the ones we're talking about that our local insects can't eat them.
So, for example, in our garden, there's all this oregano that is a plant that is, I assume it's not from here. There's no wild oregano that I know of in the area.
Right.
But it's covered with weeds. It's covered with all kinds of different diversity.
And it's growing really well, right?
Yeah, it grows.
So what I'm saying is, the bees may be able to take advantage of it. All the other insects, like caterpillars, can't. And that's why they grow so well, because they're not having a lot of competition for the flesh of the flower, of the flesh of the plant. But yeah, a lot of the things that we think are great bee plants are great bee plants, but they're not great plants for nature in our ecosystem. It's an important distinction. It's a good question. So this is a study in Germany. They looked at all the every year they do a big sampling of the flying bugs, and they found over 27 years, they only found 25% of the species of the volume that they had when they started. And that's going back to all the, and it could be explained by, there's a lot of different areas in Germany. In the middle of summer is the worst, 4 out of 5 bees, or 4 out of 5, the weight was only 20% of what it had been, 30 years earlier. They could explain it through all the weather or land use or habitat characteristics, but now they're thinking, is it because we have a lot of invasive plants in there that insects aren't able to eat? And when you think about insects and ecosystems, you realize that has a lot of significance for long-term ecosystem health. True for wild bees. Same study, there's 2 different articles, but I've talked about that the assumption was, starting in the mid to early 90s, people got into iNaturalist, and people started to look at all this stuff. And so the assumption was, because we have so many more amateurs, and I don't mean that in a bad way, amateurs taking pictures and turning them in, that we should be detecting more species. But in fact, what they found was, since 1990, we were seeing 25% less worldwide. Which is like, why? Which plants?
The plants that are ornamentals but are not doing the insects anymore.
Probably, but I don't.
Oh, we like beautiful gardens and beautiful, but.
It's called going to your native nursery and asking them what they have that can compete with those showy things. So your garden might not be as showy. I mean, that's the trade-off, but it'll be healthier for everybody. But I don't know.
Native, we just have to go with native plants, that's what you're saying.
That's what I'm saying, native plants for the winter. Which is sad, because I kind of like all those tree plants. But similar study was done just in the United States, same conclusion. 25% are declining quickly. Half the species they are sure we're declining, but nobody notices because we haven't looked for them. It's not just plants and ecosystems, it's people. This is Washington. All that red are crops and things that use native pollinators. So when we lose native pollinators, it's really going to affect our agricultural issues here in the United States and Washington proper. It's not just bees, this is butterflies. Again, it's 1.6% per year, but if you run those numbers in 40 years of the study, the numbers like, many fewer butterflies in the landscape than there were 40 years ago. But it's just sad talking about all this stuff. It is sad for me. The counter is, it's easy to make a difference as an individual and as a community. If you plant, as I've seen people doing, pollinator gardens, very helpful. If, as a neighborhood, and this is more for the west side where the neighborhoods are like tighter, if you get your neighborhood to buy into that, you're creating an amazing amount of habitat for bees and other species. And if we talk to our elected officials and public agencies and talk about what you should be doing, if you're a wildlife agency, for example, what you should be doing in a wildlife management area is not just managing for deer and elk. You should be managing for all the species. And we see that. Sitting in when we look at parks on the west side, it's like, they don't all have to be ball fields. Or they can be a baseball field and some habitat behind it. It doesn't have to be one or the other, but it needs to have some habitat there as well as just a place to play. Our DOT has been really good about trying to plant pollinator plants in the right-of-ways of our roads. And at the state level, we're trying to work with, and the governor's a great example. He turned to the governor and his wife, Trudy. The governor's grounds has a lot of pollinator plants. They also have a honeybee hive, which I keep talking to them about, and they don't want to listen to, but which is a whole other subject. But they're really focused on how do we change it from green grass to plants that are helpful for insects. State parks, wildlife management areas, or just some other examples. So, one of my mottos is learn them, respect them, protect them. If you don't learn about them, you don't care about them. I mean, I never thought about bees before, but once I learned, I'm like, oh my goodness. Plant native plants. Plant plants that'll be in bloom across the entire season, because you'll have different species of native bees every 2 or 3 weeks. So if you only plant in the spring, you're neglecting all the summer and fall bees. And then think about, and again, on this part of the state, in this community, probably lots of nesting, overwintering habitat in the wild. But on the west side, where it's much more developed, you really have to be thoughtful about leaving some leaves on the ground, leaving some ground undisturbed for example, bumblebees to go underground over winter. Because if you only protect them in the summer and they don't survive the winter because there's no wintering habitat, you're not being as effective as you could be. And then,
will mulch work for that?
yeah. One thing I want to stress, we are lucky, at least for now, that's the political statement that I should have said, to live in a democracy. Because democracies respond to public opinion. We're electing our elected officials. So when we say pollinators are important to us, they listen. We went to the legislature and they're funding the bee atlas. So at the local level, at the county level, state level, when you talk to your elected officials, bring up pollinators and insects, because they listen. It's just, I mean, it's sad but true, but if you don't say something. And then, you know, stand up and say, I like pollinators, we should do more about it. So, Bees in Your Backyard is a great book to get started with native bees. Diversity Society has pollinator plant lists. Bumblebees of the Western U.S. is a nice guide to bumblebees. You got the website, Washington Bumblebees, that one. Native Bee Society. Again, 4th Thursday, 7 p.m. Don't have to be a member. And sign up to get your link and we'll send you a notice every month. You good?
Love iPhone.
Thank you very much.
Oh, that's one.
So, I just recently had a chance to visit Florida, and they had a program there where they had a specific thing all around the state to plant a specific flower that had gone extinct, and they were able to bring back an extinct butterfly from captivity into the wild. We were actually able to see some while we were there. Somebody actually pointed this out to me.
Right.
Are there specific plants that we can plant for some of these bees, like that western bumblebee that are in the flower?
So that's what we're trying to figure out with the pollen analysis we're going to be doing. Because just because you see it on a flower doesn't mean it's an important pollen source for the young. So we're still learning.
Okay.
But what's nice about insects is you give them a chance, they can rebound really quickly.
Yeah.
So I think there was a question over here. Okay, yes, go for it.
Oh, how long do you think it might be before those native plant mixes that you were talking about being one out on the atlas?
So we're collecting bees this year, and we're going to leave the pollen on. So hopefully we're going to be able to start next year or the year after. So yeah, that's the part that I've been pushing really hard. Don't just collect the bees, make a difference for the future.